In the spring of 2019, a contractor named Dale Hutchins was hired to replace the rotting floorboards in the dining room of an antebellum mansion in Natchez, Mississippi. The house, known locally as the Belmore Estate, had been purchased the previous year by a preservation society and was undergoing its first major renovation in over 40 years. Hutchins had done this kind of work his entire career. Old houses in Natchez were full of surprises. Settling foundations, hidden cisterns, walls that had been bricked over and forgotten. He thought he had seen everything. He had not. On the third day of work, when his crew pulled up the last section of original flooring near the eastern wall of the dining room, they found something beneath the subfloor that stopped every man in the room cold. A trapdoor. It was roughly 3 feet by 4 feet, framed in hand-hewn cypress timber, fitted with iron hinges that had been painted over so many times that the door had become essentially invisible against the surrounding wood. It had a latch mechanism on the underside, meaning it could only be opened from below. There was no handle on the top. Whoever had used this door had not intended to be found coming out of it. Hutchins called the Preservation Society immediately. The society's director, a historian named Margaret Aldis, drove to the site within the hour. When she descended into the space below the trapdoor using a flashlight and a ladder borrowed from Hutchins's truck, she found herself standing at the top of a staircase that descended 14 steps into the earth beneath Belmore Estate. At the bottom of those stairs was a room, not a root cellar, not a storage space. A room, roughly 12 feet by 15 feet, with plaster walls, a ventilation shaft cut through the stone foundation, and the remnants of furniture. 2 wooden bed frames, a small table, a bucket, and on the eastern wall, scratched into the plaster in a hand that was clearly unpracticed but unmistakably deliberate, a series of marks. Margaret Aldis stood in that room for a long time before she spoke. When she finally said something, it was not to Hutchins or to the other men waiting at the top of the stairs. It was barely audible. She said they were here. They were really here. The Belmore Estate was built in 1841 by a cotton merchant named Harlan Belmore, who had come to Natchez from Virginia in the 1830s and made his fortune in the cotton trade during the most profitable decade the Mississippi River Valley had ever seen. The house was an architectural statement. 3 stories of Greek Revival grandeur with 6 columns across the front facade, a sweeping central staircase, 14-foot ceilings, and hand-painted wallpaper imported from France. It was the kind of house that announced its owner's wealth before you reached the front gate. Harlan Belmore was 51 years old when the house was completed. He was known in Natchez as a man of careful habits and considerable intelligence, a deacon in the First Presbyterian Church, a member of the Adams County Court, a man whose word was considered reliable in business dealings and whose plantation, located 6 miles north of the main house, produced enough cotton to keep him among the wealthiest men in the county. He enslaved 47 people at the plantation, and 8 more who worked in the Natchez house itself. What Harlan Belmore was not known as, what would not become part of any public record until Margaret Aldis began her research in the weeks following the discovery of the hidden room, was an operative, a man who had, beginning sometime in the mid-1840s, transformed the basement of his own dining room into a way station on what historians now recognize as one of the most active routes of the Underground Railroad in the Deep South. The discovery of the room immediately raised a question that Harlan Belmore's neighbors, his business associates, and the members of his church had been positioned to ask for over a century and a half. How does a cotton merchant in Natchez, Mississippi, a man who legally owned 55 human beings and whose entire financial existence depended on the institution of slavery, end up with a secret room under his dining room floor, designed specifically to hide people fleeing that same institution? The answer, pieced together from court records, private correspondence, estate documents, and the marks scratched into the plaster wall of the hidden room, is more complicated and more human than any simple explanation would suggest. Harlan Belmore had a daughter. Her name was Cecilia, and she was born in 1822, the only child of Harlan and his wife Eleanor, who died of fever in 1824 when Cecilia was 2 years old. Harlan never remarried. Cecilia was raised in a series of households, first by her maternal grandmother in Virginia, then by a series of tutors and household staff in Natchez, and finally, beginning at the age of 14, largely by her own considerable intelligence and apparently insatiable appetite for reading every book she could find. By the time she was 18, Cecilia Belmore had read more widely than most men in Natchez twice her age, including her father, and had developed views on the institution of slavery that were, in the context of Adams County, Mississippi in 1840, nothing short of incendiary. She did not announce these views publicly. She was not stupid. She lived in a society where openly anti-slavery sentiment could result in social destruction, legal persecution, or worse. But she did write them down in a series of private journals that she kept hidden in her bedroom, and she did act on them quietly, carefully, and in a way that required the active cooperation of her father and the absolute silence of at least a dozen other people over a period of approximately 15 years. The first person to use a hidden room beneath the Belmore dining room, according to evidence Margaret Aldous eventually assembled from multiple sources, arrived in the autumn of 1846. A man, traveling alone, who had walked from a plantation near Vicksburg. He stayed for 4 days. Then he was gone, moved northward through a chain of contacts that Cecilia had spent 2 years carefully building. He left his mark on the plaster wall. A single horizontal line, the first of many. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe and hit the bell, because what Margaret Aldous found scratched into that wall and what it revealed about the Belmore family and the network they operated is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American resistance. And we are only just getting started. The marks on the wall were the first thing Margaret Aldous photographed when she returned to the hidden room the following morning with proper lighting equipment and a colleague from the University of Mississippi's History Department, a man named Dr. Philip Reese, who specialized in antebellum Mississippi. They spent 4 hours in that room before either of them felt they had adequately documented what they were looking at. The marks covered most of the eastern wall and extended partway onto the northern wall. They were not random. They were organized into distinct groupings, each grouping separated from the next by a small symbol that Reese eventually identified as a simplified rendering of the North Star, a mark that appears in other documented Underground Railroad sites and that served as a directional symbol in the network's informal visual language. Within each grouping, the marks varied. Most were simple lines, tally marks, the most basic form of human record keeping, but some were more complex. Initials, dates, rendered in a format that took Reese several days to decode because a year was consistently abbreviated in a way that differed from standard notation, and in 3 separate places on the wall. Full words had been scratched in letters so small they required magnification to read clearly. The first word was freedom. The second was north. The third was a name, Cecilia. That name changed everything about how Margaret Aldous understood what she was looking at. She had already been researching Harlan Belmore's history, looking for documentation of the hidden room in estate records and correspondence. She had found almost nothing directly, which was itself significant. A man as meticulous in his record-keeping as Harlan Belmore, whose business ledgers were models of careful documentation, had left almost no paper trail relating to the basement room or its construction. The room itself did not appear in any of the 3 sets of architectural drawings that had been made of the house between 1841 and 1865. It was not mentioned in any inventory of the property. It was, to every official record of the Belmore estate, simply non-existent. But Cecilia had left a record, not intentionally, not in any document she had written for posterity. The record she left was the one the people who passed through the room had made themselves. The marks on the wall that bore her name, placed there by someone who wanted to record, in the most permanent way available to them, who had helped them. Margaret Aldous began tracing Cecilia Belmore's life with a new intensity after finding the name on the wall. What she found over the following months, through genealogical records, church documents, correspondence preserved in the archives of a Quaker meeting in Ohio, and a single extraordinary cache of letters discovered in a trunk in the attic of a house in Cincinnati that had once belonged to a conductor on the Underground Railroad, was a portrait of a woman whose moral courage and organizational sophistication had been entirely invisible to the historical record. Cecilia Belmore had begun her work in 1844, 2 years before the first person used the hidden room. She had spent those 2 years making contacts, building trust with a network of free black people in Natchez who served as the first links in chain that extended northward through Tennessee and Kentucky into Ohio. This was extraordinarily dangerous work. The Fugitive Slave Act made any assistance to an escaped enslaved person a federal crime. In Mississippi, the penalties were severe. A white person found guilty of aiding escape could face years in prison. A free black person faced a permanent loss of their freedom status and a return to enslavement. Cecilia understood these risks precisely. The Cincinnati Letters, written by a woman named Hannah Clark who served as a conductor in Ohio, make clear that Cecilia had communicated extensively with the northern end of the network before she set up the Natchez operation. She wanted to be certain that anyone she sent northward would actually arrive safely, that the chain would hold before she asked anyone to risk their life trusting it. The hidden room was Harlan Belmore's contribution. Cecilia had apparently approached her father sometime in 1845, and whatever conversation passed between them in private had resulted in Harlan hiring a carpenter from New Orleans, a man he had no previous business relationship with and whom he paid in cash with no record in his accounts, to construct the trapdoor and the room below the dining room floor. The carpenter was paid, returned to New Orleans, and left no record of the work he had done. Harlan never referenced the room in any document. He never mentioned it in his will. He simply made it possible and then stepped back. What Harlan Belmore made of what his daughter was doing, whether he approved or simply chose not to interfere, is one of the questions a historical record cannot fully answer. He continued to enslave people at both his plantation and his Natchez house. Throughout the years, the hidden room was an operation. He continued to attend church, to serve on the county court, to conduct his business affairs in the normal manner of a prosperous Natchez cotton merchant. He gave no outward indication that anything was different, but there is one document that suggests his internal position was more complicated than his external behavior indicated. In 1852, Harlan Belmore wrote a letter to his brother in Virginia that was preserved in a family archive and discovered by a graduate student in 1987. The letter concerned a business matter, the sale of a parcel of land, and was entirely ordinary in its content, except for 2 sentences near the end. Harlan wrote, "I find myself, in my older years, in a state of considerable contradiction that I have not been able to resolve and suspect I never will. I have done things I am not proud of and permitted things I believe to be right, and I am not certain which of these will weigh more heavily in the final accounting." He never explained what he meant. His brother, if he understood the reference, said nothing in his reply. The letter was filed away with other family correspondence and forgotten for over a century. But Margaret Aldis, when she read it, felt certain she understood exactly what Harlan Belmore was describing. The room beneath the dining room floor received, by the best estimate Aldis and Reese could construct from the wall markings and the historical record, between 80 and 110 people over a period of approximately 15 years, from 1846 to 1861. They came primarily from plantations in the Natchez District, the most heavily enslaved region in the entire South. They stayed in the room for periods ranging from one night to several weeks, depending on the conditions outside. They left through a network that moved them northward in stages, each stage managed by a different conductor who knew only their own portion of the route. Not all of them made it. The name that appears most frequently in the documentation Margaret Aldis assembled was not Cecilia Belmore. It was a free black woman named Judith Pierce, and the fact that history had never recorded her name before 2019 is itself a story about whose contributions get remembered and whose get erased. Judith Pierce was born free in Natchez in 1818, the daughter of a free black carpenter named Samuel Pierce, who had purchased his own freedom in 1805 and spent the following 3 decades building a small but stable existence in a city that offered almost nothing to free black people except the permanent threat of re-enslavement. Judith had grown up watching her father navigate that precarious world with a combination of practical skill and extraordinary political intelligence, and she had inherited both qualities in full measure. By 1844, when Cecilia Belmore first contacted her, Judith was 26 years old, unmarried, and working as a seamstress with client lists that included several of the most prominent white households in Natchez. This was not accidental. Judith had cultivated those clients with a specific purpose of moving through the city's white social world with a degree of freedom that most free black people in Natchez could not achieve. She was invited into parlors, allowed into private spaces, trusted with family correspondence on occasion, and privy to conversations that her clients assumed she was not listening to carefully enough to retain. She was listening to all of it when Cecilia approached her through a chain of 3 intermediaries. Judith spent 6 weeks evaluating the proposal before she agreed to participate. She interviewed, through her own network of trusted contacts, every person Cecilia had already approached. She assessed the security of the proposed route northward, identified its weakest points, and refused to proceed until those weaknesses were addressed. She was, in the language of modern organizational theory, the operational director of the Natchez network. Cecilia provided the physical infrastructure, the hidden room, and the financial resources. Judith provided everything else. The logistics she managed were staggering. Every person who passed through the hidden room at Belmore Estate had to be identified, assessed with physical capacity to travel, equipped with food and basic supplies for the journey northward, and connected with the next link in the chain. The timing of each departure had to be coordinated with weather, patrol schedules, and the movements of people in the white community who might notice an unusual absence. Judith maintained all of this in her memory, committing nothing to paper, because paper could be found. Margaret Aldis found Judith Pierce through a document that should not have existed. In 1865, after the war ended and the threat of legal consequences had diminished, a Quaker minister in Cincinnati named Abraham Wells wrote a private memoir of his work as an Underground Railroad conductor. The memoir was never published. It passed through his family for 3 generations before being donated to a historical society in 1962, where it sat uncatalogued in an archive box for 57 years, until a volunteer cataloger found it in 2018, a year before the hidden room was discovered. Wells named Judith Pierce explicitly in 2 places, describing her as the most capable organizer he had encountered in 15 years of work, and crediting her with the survival of people who would otherwise certainly have been caught. The memoir also contained a detail that resolved one of the central mysteries of the Belmore Estate story. Margaret Aldis had wondered, from the beginning of her research, why the operation had ended when it did. The wall markings in the hidden room stopped abruptly in 1861. Not with the beginning of the Civil War as she had initially assumed, but several months before the war began. Something had caused the network to shut down suddenly in the spring of 1861, before any of the military events that might have provided cover or motivation for ending the operation. Wells explained it in 2 sentences. He wrote that his contact in Natchez had informed him in early 1861 that the situation had become untenable, that someone in the white community had begun asking questions that suggested awareness of the operation, and that the decision had been made to shut down all activity immediately and permanently. He noted that he never learned who had been asking questions or how close they had come to uncovering the network. He only knew that his Natchez contact, whom he identified as Jay, had made a decision under extreme pressure and had made the right one. The network was never discovered. No arrest was ever made. No prosecution was ever initiated. Whatever threat had prompted the shutdown in 1861, it had been neutralized by the shutdown itself. After the war, Cecilia Belmore did not return to Natchez. She had left the city in 1862, traveling northward under circumstances that the historical record does not fully document, and settled eventually in Philadelphia, where she lived until her death in 1891. She never married. She left no memoir and no public account of her work. Her obituary in a Philadelphia newspaper described her only as a native of Mississippi who had lived quietly in the city for nearly 3 decades and who had been active in charitable causes. Judith Pierce remained in Natchez after the war. She is listed in the 1870 census as a seamstress, age 52, living alone. She appears in no document after that. What became of her, where she died, whether she left descendants, is not known. She is one of thousands of people whose contributions to American history were so carefully hidden during their lifetimes, for reasons of survival, that the hiding outlasted the danger and became permanent erasure. The marks on the wall are what remain. 80 to 110 sets of marks, each one representing a person who came down those 14 steps in darkness, who slept on a wooden bed frame in a room 12 feet by 15 feet below the dining room floor of a cotton merchant's mansion, who waited in that room until Judith Pierce decided it was safe to move, and who then continued northward through a chain of hands they would never see all at once. 3 of those marks, identified through genealogical research that Margaret Aldis initiated and that is still ongoing, have been connected to specific individuals. A man named James who reached Cincinnati in 1849 and whose descendants still live in Ohio. A woman named Clara who arrived in Philadelphia in 1853 and whose great-granddaughter was located by Aldis through a DNA genealogy database in 2021. And a child, age approximately 10, whose mark is smaller than the others and whose initials, E.T., appear beside the North Star symbol in the middle of the Eastern Wall. Who E.T. was, where they went, whether they survived the journey north, is not yet known. The research continues. The Belmore estate is open to visitors now. The hidden room has been carefully preserved and incorporated into the house tour. A plaque on the wall of the dining room describes the discovery and its historical significance. The trapdoor has been restored, the iron hinges cleaned and oiled, the latch mechanism on the underside repaired, so that it works exactly as it did when it was built in 1845 by a carpenter whose name no record preserved. When visitors descend the 14 steps and stand in that room, they stand where somewhere between 80 and 110 people stood before them. People who had nothing and were risking everything, who waited in darkness for a word from a free black seamstress in Natchez that it was safe to move, who scratched their marks into the plaster wall because they wanted to leave some record that they had existed, that they had passed through this place, that they had kept going. The marks are still there. They will be there as long as the house stands. Small lines scratched into plaster by hands that were shaking or steady, by people who were terrified or determined or both, by human beings whose names we mostly do not know and whose courage we are still, 2 centuries later, trying to fully comprehend. Natchez, Mississippi. A contractor pulled up a floor and found a door. And beneath that door was a story that changes everything we thought we knew about who resisted and how and at what cost. Some houses hold their secrets for a reason. This one held its long enough for the people it protected to reach safety. That was exactly the point.